Before diving into these forgotten seekers of history's shadows, imagine the most brutal form of execution ever devised by human cruelty. If you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Today, we uncover what hanged, drawn, and quartered truly meant through the final moments of Scotland's greatest hero. The iron chains bit deep into William Wallace's wrists as the executioner's cart jolted over London's cobbled streets. Blood had long since dried on his face from the beating at Westminster Hall, where King Edward's judges pronounced the death sentence that would echo through centuries. The crowd pressed closer, their faces a mixture of bloodlust and morbid fascination. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders to glimpse the Scottish rebel who had dared defy England's might. Wallace's massive frame, once capable of wielding a 6-foot sword with deadly precision, now slumped forward against the wooden restraints. His long auburn hair, matted with sweat and grime, fell across features carved by years of warfare. The deep scar running from his left temple to his jaw, a memento from the Battle of Falkirk, seemed to throb with each heartbeat. "Look upon the traitor!" shouted a voice from the crowd. Wallace raised his head slowly, his steel blue eyes scanning the sea of hostile faces. Even in chains, even broken and bloodied, there remained something unconquerable in his gaze. The executioner's assistant, a thin man with nervous hands, avoided looking directly at the prisoner. The cartwheels ground against stone as they turned onto Smithfield's approach. The acrid smell of smoke and death hung heavy in the morning air. This place had witnessed countless executions, but none quite like what awaited Scotland's champion. Wallace's breathing remained steady, despite the terror that must have gripped his heart. He had led armies, stormed castles, and fought impossible odds. But nothing could have prepared him for this final battle against human cruelty. As the crowd's roar grew louder, Wallace closed his eyes briefly, perhaps remembering the rolling hills of Scotland, the faces of fallen comrades, or the freedom he had fought so desperately to secure. The cart lurched to a final stop, and the executioner's work was about to begin. The executioner emerged from the crowd like death itself taking human form. Thomas de Normanville stood 6.5 feet tall, his leather apron already stained dark from previous work. His face, partially hidden beneath a black hood, revealed only cold, professional eyes that had witnessed more suffering than most men could imagine. In his massive hands, he carried the tools of his grisly trade: rope, blade, and iron brazier already glowing with coals. Wallace watched this spectre approach, knowing that this man would orchestrate his final moments on earth. The crowd pressed closer, their excited murmurs rising to a fever pitch. Merchants hawked meat pies and ale, treating the execution like a festival. Children darted between legs, trying to get closer to the spectacle that would haunt their dreams for years to come. "William Wallace of Scotland," Normanville's voice boomed across Smithfield, "you have been condemned to death for treason, rebellion, and murder against our sovereign lord, King Edward." His words carried the weight of royal authority, each syllable pronounced with deliberate menace. The executioner's assistants, 2 burly men with faces like granite, began arranging the instruments of torture with practiced efficiency. Wallace's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. His eyes never left Normanville's face, studying the man who would end his life. There was something almost respectful in the executioner's bearing. He was a craftsman about to perform his most challenging work. The crowd sensed the tension building and fell into an expectant hush. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the execution ground. Wallace could smell the fear sweat of the crowd, mixed with the metallic scent of blood, that seemed permanently embedded in Smithfield's earth. His hands clenched into fists within their iron restraints, knuckles white with tension. The executioner nodded to his assistants, and they began to unlock Wallace's shackles. The first phase of his ordeal was about to begin. The rope felt coarse against Wallace's neck as the executioner's assistants positioned the noose with practiced precision. The hemp fibers scratched his skin, each strand a reminder of the agony to come. The gallows stood 13 feet high, its wooden beam worn smooth by countless previous victims. Wallace's feet remained firmly planted on the platform, but he could feel the trapdoor's outline beneath his boots. Normanville stepped forward, his massive hands checking the rope's placement with the attention of a master craftsman. "The first punishment," he announced to the crowd, "hanging until nearly dead." His voice carried across the hushed gathering, explaining the process as if conducting a lecture. Wallace's breathing quickened despite his attempts to remain calm. The crowd surged forward, pressing against the wooden barriers erected to contain them. Faces contorted with bloodthirsty anticipation stared up at the condemned man. Some spectators had climbed onto rooftops and walls, desperate for a better view of Scotland's champion meeting his fate. The executioner's assistants took their positions, one at the trapdoor's release, another monitoring Wallace's condition. Wallace's mind raced through memories of battles won and lost, of comrades who had fallen beside him, of the Scottish homeland he would never see again. His legs trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the knowledge that soon they would dance in empty air as life slowly ebbed from his body. The executioner raised his hand, signalling the crowd to silence. "Any final words, William Wallace of Scotland?" Normanville's question echoed across Smithfield. Wallace lifted his head, his voice carrying clearly despite the noose's pressure. "I die for Scotland's freedom, and no English rope can strangle that truth." The crowd erupted in angry shouts, some calling for his immediate death, others grudgingly respecting his defiance. The executioner nodded grimly and stepped back. His hand dropped in a swift, decisive motion. The trapdoor opened with a thunderous crack, and William Wallace plunged into the abyss, the rope singing with sudden tension as it caught his full weight. Wallace's body jerked violently as the rope snapped taut, the sudden stop sending shockwaves through his massive frame. His neck didn't break. The drop was carefully calculated to strangle slowly rather than kill instantly. His feet kicked frantically in empty air, searching for purchase that would never come. The crowd's roar reached a deafening crescendo as they watched Scotland's hero dance his death dance. His hands clawed desperately at the rope, instinct overriding pride as his body fought for survival. The hemp fibers cut into his palms, leaving bloody tracks on his fingers. His face began to darken, changing from its natural color to deep red, then purple as oxygen fled his starving lungs. Saliva gathered at the corners of his mouth, and his eyes bulged with the terrible pressure building in his skull. The executioner stood below, pocket watch in hand, timing the hanging with professional precision. Too long, and Wallace would die, ruining the elaborate torture planned. Too short, and he would recover too quickly. Normanville had perfected this timing through years of practice, knowing exactly when to intervene. The crowd counted along, some shouting encouragement to the dying man, others urging the executioner to let him suffer longer. Wallace's struggles grew weaker as consciousness began to slip away. His kicks became less frantic, his clawing at the rope more feeble. Blood vessels burst in his eyes, creating a web of red across the whites. His tongue protruded slightly, and a terrible gurgling sound escaped his throat. The crowd pressed closer, mesmerized by this intimate view of death. Just as Wallace's body began to go limp, as his struggles ceased and his eyes rolled back, the executioner raised his hand. "Cut him down." The assistants moved with practiced speed. one man climbing the gallows while another positioned a stretcher below. The rope was severed, and Wallace's unconscious form crashed down, his body striking the wooden platform with a sickening thud. He lay motionless, chest barely rising and falling, while the crowd screamed for more. Cold water struck Wallace's face like a physical blow, shocking him back to consciousness. He gasped and sputtered, his damaged throat producing only rasping sounds as air fought its way into his tortured lungs. The executioner's assistant stood over him with an empty bucket, ready to repeat the process if necessary. Wallace's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and filled with the confusion of a man torn back from death's threshold. His hands moved instinctively to his throat, feeling the deep rope burn that now encircled his neck like a collar of fire. Every swallow sent waves of agony through his damaged windpipe. The crowd cheered as they saw him stirring, their bloodlust far from satisfied. Children pointed excitedly at the condemned man, while their parents lifted them higher for a better view of the spectacle. Normanville knelt beside Wallace, checking his pulse with professional interest. The Scottish warrior's heart hammered against his ribs, his body fighting to recover from near death. "Good," the executioner murmured. "Strong enough for what comes next." Wallace tried to speak, but could only produce a harsh whisper, his vocal cords damaged by the rope's crushing pressure. The assistants hauled Wallace to his feet, his legs buckling under his own weight. They dragged him to a wooden table that had been prepared during his hanging, a butcher's block worn smooth by countless victims. Iron shackles secured his wrists and ankles to the corners, spreading his body in an X formation. The position left him completely vulnerable, unable to protect himself from what was coming. Wallace's vision cleared enough to see the brazier of glowing coals positioned nearby, iron implements heating to white-hot intensity. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that the true horror was about to begin. Some spectators fainted at the sight of the torture devices, while others pushed forward with morbid fascination. Wallace tested his bonds once, found them secure, then lay still, conserving his strength for the ordeal ahead. His eyes found the sky above, perhaps seeking some final comfort in Scotland's distant heavens. The first cut began just above Wallace's navel, the executioner's blade sliding through skin with surgical precision. Wallace's back arched against the wooden table, every muscle in his body contracting in response to the searing pain. His damaged throat produced only strangled gasps, the rope burn preventing him from screaming properly. Blood welled up from the incision, bright red against his pale skin. Normanville worked with the careful attention of a master craftsman, his knife-following anatomical knowledge passed down through generations of executioners. The disembowelment had to be performed correctly. Too deep, and Wallace would die too quickly. Too shallow, and the desired effect wouldn't be achieved. The crowd pressed against the barriers, some turning away in horror, while others watched with fascinated disgust. Wallace's hands clenched into fists so tight that his nails drew blood from his palms. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with tears he couldn't prevent, as agony overwhelmed his senses. His legs pulled against their restraints, seeking any escape from the torment being inflicted upon his body. The executioner paused occasionally, allowing Wallace to feel the full impact of each cut before continuing. The smell of blood filled the air, metallic and warm, mixed with the acrid scent of fear sweat from the crowd. Some spectators had begun to vomit, their stomachs unable to handle the reality of judicial torture. Others fainted and were carried away by friends or family members, but most remained, transfixed by this intimate display of human suffering. Normanville's blade moved lower, beginning the process that would expose Wallace's internal organs to the air. The Scottish warrior's breathing became shallow and rapid, his body going into shock as blood loss and trauma took their toll. His eyes rolled back, consciousness threatening to abandon him again. But the executioner had experienced assistants ready with smelling salts and cold water. determined to keep their victim awake for every moment of his ordeal. The crowd's noise faded to a distant murmur as Wallace's world narrowed to pure sensation. The fire in his abdomen, the iron taste of blood in his mouth, the desperate struggle to remain conscious. The executioner's hands moved inside Wallace's body cavity with practiced skill, locating and grasping the specific organs that would complete this phase of the execution. Wallace's consciousness flickered like a candle in wind as he felt the impossible violation of his own body being opened and explored. His breathing came in short, desperate gasps, each breath a monumental effort that sent fresh waves of agony through his torn abdomen. Normanville withdrew his hands carefully, holding Wallace's entrails up for the crowd to see. The intestines steamed in the cool morning air, pink and glistening with blood. A collective gasp arose from the spectators. Even those who had come seeking gore found themselves confronted with more than they had bargained for. Several women fainted outright, while men turned away, their faces green with nausea. Wallace's eyes focused on the sky above, desperately trying to escape mentally from what was being done to his body. He could feel his life ebbing away with each heartbeat, blood pooling beneath him on the wooden table. His lips moved soundlessly, perhaps in prayer, or perhaps speaking to the ghosts of fallen comrades who seemed to hover at the edges of his vision. The executioner placed the removed organs into the brazier, where they sizzled and smoked in the glowing coals. The acrid smell of burning flesh added another layer of horror to the already overwhelming scene. Wallace's body convulsed involuntarily as he smelled his own organs burning, his mind struggling to process the incomprehensible reality of his situation. "Behold the traitor's bowels," Normanville announced to the crowd, his voice carrying over their horrified murmurs. Some spectators cheered, caught up in the mob mentality, while others began to drift away, their appetite for spectacle finally satisfied. Wallace's head lolled to one side, consciousness slipping despite the executioner's efforts to keep him aware. The morning sun climbed higher, its rays illuminating a scene that would haunt witness accounts for generations. Wallace's massive frame, once capable of striking fear into English hearts, now lay broken and opened like a butchered animal. Yet somehow his spirit remained unbroken. The executioner's blade moved to Wallace's groin with deliberate precision, beginning the final and most brutal aspect of the punishment. The emasculation was performed with the same methodical care that had characterized every aspect of this orchestrated torture. Wallace's body jerked violently against the restraints, his back arching so severely that the wooden table creaked under the strain. Blood flowed freely, adding to the growing pool beneath him. His mouth opened in a silent scream, the damaged vocal cords producing only a wet, rasping sound that barely qualified as human. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Many turned away completely, while others vomited where they stood. Even the most hardened spectators found themselves confronted with a level of cruelty that challenged their capacity to witness human suffering. Normanville worked quickly, knowing that Wallace's life was now measured in minutes rather than hours. The Scottish warrior's face had gone deathly pale, his skin taking on a greyish hue as blood loss and shock overwhelmed his massive constitution. His eyes, once so fierce in battle, now stared unseeing at the grey London sky, consciousness fading in and out like waves against a distant shore. The executioner's assistant moved to prepare the final implements, the quartering axes and ropes that would complete Wallace's punishment. But it was becoming clear that the condemned man might not survive long enough to experience the full horror that had been planned for him. His breathing became increasingly laboured, each breath a struggle against the tide of death that was rapidly advancing. Wallace's hands, still clenched in fists, began to relax as his body's strength finally began to fail. The crowd sensed that the end was near, and their bloodthirsty cheers gave way to an eerie quiet. Some began to drift away, their appetite for spectacle finally sated by the horror they had witnessed. Others remained transfixed, watching Scotland's greatest hero fight his final battle, not against English armies, but against death itself. The morning air filled with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smoke from the brazier where Wallace's organs continued to burn. Death approached William Wallace like an old friend, offering release from the unimaginable torment that had been inflicted upon his body. His breathing became shallow and irregular, each inhalation a monumental effort that sent ripples of pain through his mutilated form. The executioner stepped back, recognizing the signs of approaching death in his victim's glazed eyes and slack features. Wallace's mind drifted between consciousness and oblivion, images of Scotland's green hills flickering behind his closed eyelids. He saw the faces of fallen comrades, Andrew Moray, who had died at Stirling Bridge, and countless others who had given their lives for Scottish freedom. Their ghostly forms seemed to beckon him forward, promising peace after the horror of his final hours on earth. The crowd had grown quieter, sensing that they were witnessing something profound beyond mere execution. Some spectators removed their caps in grudging respect, while others crossed themselves, perhaps recognizing that they had seen more cruelty than any human should endure. The morning sun continued its climb, casting long shadows across Smithfield's blood-soaked ground. Normanville checked Wallace's pulse, finding it weak and erratic. The Scottish warrior's massive heart, which had driven him through countless battles, now struggled to pump blood through his devastated body. His lips moved almost imperceptibly, perhaps speaking final words that only he could hear, or perhaps bidding farewell to the homeland he would never see again. Wallace's eyes opened one final time, their steel-blue depths still holding a spark of defiance even as death claimed him. His gaze found something in the distance, perhaps Scotland itself, calling him home across the centuries. A single tear tracked down his bloodied cheek, and then William Wallace, guardian of Scotland and champion of freedom, drew his last breath. The executioner placed his fingers against Wallace's throat, confirming what everyone already knew. "He is dead," Normanville announced to the crowd, his professional voice carrying a note of something that might have been respect. The greatest judicial execution in English history had claimed its victim, but somehow the victor remained unclear. Even in death, Wallace's torment was not complete. The executioner's assistants worked quickly to prepare the body for the final phase of punishment, quartering. 4 strong horses stood ready, their reins held by mounted riders who understood their grim task. Ropes were secured around Wallace's lifeless limbs, each knot tied with the expertise of men who had performed this ritual before. The crowd pressed forward again, their morbid curiosity overcoming the horror they had just witnessed. Children who had been shielded during the worst of the torture now craned their necks to see what would happen next. The horses stamped impatiently, sensing the tension in their handlers and the excited energy radiating from the spectators. Normanville supervised the rope placement with his characteristic attention to detail. The quartering had to be performed correctly. Too much force and the limbs would separate too quickly. Too little, and the spectacle would lose its intended impact. Wallace's body, still warm despite death, was positioned carefully on the ground, each rope pulling in a different direction. The executioner raised his hand, signaling the horsemen to prepare. The riders tightened their grips on the reins, their mounts sensing the coming action. Foam flecked the horses' bits as they were held in check, their powerful muscles coiled and ready to surge forward. The crowd fell into an expectant silence, broken only by the snorting of horses and the creak of leather. Wallace's face, peaceful in death, showed none of the agony that had marked his final living moments. His steel-blue eyes stared sightlessly at the grey London sky, perhaps finally seeing the Scotland he had died defending. His auburn hair, no longer matted with blood and sweat, caught the morning breeze that carried the scent of distant moors and highland streams. Let justice be completed! Normanville's voice boomed across Smithfield, echoing off the surrounding buildings. The horsemen spurred their mounts forward simultaneously, the rope snapping taut as 400 years of horsepower was applied to Wallace's lifeless form. The final desecration of Scotland's greatest hero was about to begin, even as his spirit soared free from earthly torment. The horses surged forward with tremendous force, their hooves thundering against the packed earth of Smithfield. The ropes went taut instantly, straining against Wallace's corpse with a tension that made the air itself seem to vibrate. The crowd gasped collectively as they witnessed the raw physics of quartering. 4 powerful animals pulling a human body in opposite directions with irresistible force. Wallace's limbs stretched to impossible lengths before beginning to separate from his torso. The sound was unlike anything the spectators had ever heard. A wet tearing that seemed to echo from the very stones of London itself. His left arm came away first, the shoulder joint giving way with a sickening pop that carried clearly across the execution ground. The horsemen continued their grim work, their mounts foam-flecked and wild-eyed from the strain. Wallace's right arm followed, then his legs in quick succession, each separation accompanied by that horrible rending sound that would haunt witnesses for the rest of their lives. What remained of Scotland's champion lay in 5 pieces scattered across the bloodied ground. The crowd's reaction was immediate and varied. Some cheered, caught up in the mob's bloodlust and satisfied that justice had been served. Others stood in stunned silence, finally comprehending the full horror of what judicial punishment could entail. Many turned away, their stomachs finally rebelling against the spectacle they had come to witness. Normanville surveyed the scene with professional satisfaction. The quartering had been performed flawlessly, each limb cleanly separated without excessive damage to the remains. This was important. The dismembered parts would be displayed throughout the kingdom as a warning to other potential rebels. Wallace's head would go to London Bridge, his arms to Newcastle and Berwick, his legs to Perth and Aberdeen. The executioner's assistants began gathering the scattered remains, placing them in separate wooden boxes for transport to their final destinations. Even in death and dismemberment, William Wallace would serve as a message, but perhaps not the message King Edward had intended. The morning sun climbed higher, casting harsh light on a scene that would echo through history as both the ultimate expression of royal justice and its most damning indictment. The wooden cart carrying Wallace's severed head jolted through London's narrow streets toward its final destination. His face, surprisingly peaceful despite the violence of his death, stared upward at the grey sky as if still searching for Scotland's distant mountains. The executioner's assistant driving the cart handled his grisly cargo with business-like efficiency, treating it as merely another day's work in service to the crown. Crowds lined the streets to catch a glimpse of the legendary rebel's remains. Some spat at the cart as it passed, while others crossed themselves in recognition of witnessing something that transcended ordinary justice. Children pointed excitedly at the severed head, their young minds unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of what they were seeing. London Bridge loomed ahead, its ancient stone arches rising from the Thames like the ribs of some massive beast. Dozens of previous traitors' heads already decorated the bridge's entrance, their skulls picked clean by ravens and bleached white by sun and rain. But none had been as famous as the head that would soon join their grim company. The cart stopped at the bridge's gate, where a small crowd had gathered to witness this final act in Wallace's execution. The assistant lifted the head carefully, treating it with the same professional respect that had characterized every aspect of the day's proceedings. Wallace's auburn hair fell back from his face, revealing features that seemed almost noble despite death and dismemberment. A wooden spike had been prepared, its point sharpened to pierce cleanly through skull bone. The assistant positioned Wallace's head carefully, ensuring it would face north towards Scotland. Whether by accident or design, This final gesture seemed to acknowledge the direction of his heart's true loyalty. With a decisive thrust, the spike penetrated skull and brain, securing Scotland's champion to his final resting place. The head was hoisted high above the bridge's entrance, where it would remain until weather and scavengers reduced it to bone. From this elevated position, Wallace's sightless eyes seemed to gaze across the Thames toward the distant lands he had died defending, maintaining their eternal vigil over a kingdom that had never truly conquered his spirit. Meanwhile, Wallace's dismembered arms began their separate journeys to the northern cities, where they would serve as grisly warnings to any who might challenge English rule. The first cart, carrying his right arm to Newcastle, travelled through countryside still scarred by years of warfare between England and Scotland. Villages stood abandoned, their inhabitants fled or dead, testament to the brutal conflict that had consumed both nations. The arm lay wrapped in coarse cloth, but blood still seeped through the fabric, leaving a dark trail on the cart's wooden bed. The driver, a grizzled veteran of King Edward's campaigns, showed no emotion as he guided his horses through the desolate landscape. He had seen enough death and dismemberment to become inured to such cargo, treating it as simply another task in service to his sovereign. At Newcastle's gates, a small crowd gathered to witness the arrival of Scotland's champion's remains. The city's officials had prepared a gibbet specifically for this purpose, its iron framework designed to display the arm where every passerby would see it. Children dared each other to touch the cart, while adults maintained a respectful distance from what remained of the man who had once struck terror into English hearts. The arm was secured to the gibbet with iron chains, positioned to face north towards Scotland, like an accusatory finger pointing toward the homeland Wallace had died defending. Even in death and dismemberment, there seemed to be something defiant about the way the limb was positioned, as if it retained some echo of the warrior's unbreakable spirit. Ravens gathered almost immediately, drawn by the scent of blood and the promise of fresh carrion. They perched on nearby rooftops and walls, waiting for the crowd to disperse so they could begin their grim feast. The cycle of death and decay that had claimed Wallace's body would continue here, but his legend would prove far more resistant to time's ravages. As evening approached, the crowd began to disperse, leaving the dismembered arm to begin its slow transformation from flesh to bone. The wind from the north carried hints of Highland air, as if Scotland itself was calling its lost champion home. The second cart carrying Wallace's left arm wound its way toward Berwick, following ancient Roman roads that had witnessed centuries of conflict between warring nations. The driver stopped frequently to water his horses and rest, treating his macabre cargo with the same casual indifference he might show to a load of grain or timber. Yet even he seemed to feel the weight of history pressing down upon his shoulders. Berwick upon Tweed stood as England's northernmost stronghold, a fortress city that had changed hands between Scotland and England so many times that its very stones seemed weary of war. The massive walls rose from the River Tweed, like a stone promise of English determination to hold this crucial border town. Guards patrolled the battlements, their eyes constantly scanning the northern horizon for signs of Scottish raiders. Word of Wallace's execution had reached Berwick days earlier, carried by swift messengers who brought news of the Scottish champion's capture and trial. The townspeople gathered at the gates as the cart approached, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and unease. Many had lived through Scottish raids and sieges, and they knew firsthand the devastation that Wallace's armies had brought to English soil. The arm was mounted on a specially prepared gibbet in the town's central square, where merchants and travellers would see it daily. The positioning was deliberate, facing north towards Scotland like a severed hand still reaching for the homeland it could no longer defend. Iron spikes secured the limb in place, ensuring it would remain as a permanent reminder of English justice. Local children gathered around the display, their young minds fascinated by this tangible connection to the legendary warrior they had heard about in whispered stories. Some of the older residents remembered seeing Wallace himself during his raids on English territory. A giant of a man whose very presence had seemed to embody Scottish defiance. As night fell over Berwick, torches were lit around the gibbet to ensure the display remained visible even in darkness. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the dismembered arm, creating an almost supernatural effect that would fuel local ghost stories for generations to come. Far to the north, Wallace's right leg began its journey to Perth, travelling through the heart of Scotland itself toward the ancient royal city that had crowned Scottish kings for centuries. The irony was not lost on the cart's driver, carrying the dismembered remains of Scotland's greatest hero through the very land he had died defending. The countryside bore fresh scars from English campaigns, villages burned and fields left fallow. Scottish peasants watched the cart pass with expressions of barely controlled rage and grief. Word had spread quickly through the Highlands about Wallace's brutal execution, and seeing his remains being transported like common cargo added insult to the profound injury of his death. Some crossed themselves and whispered prayers, while others spat in the dust and muttered curses against King Edward and all his works. The driver kept his head down and his pace steady, knowing that Scottish soil was dangerous ground for an Englishman carrying such cargo. His escort of armed guards remained alert, hands resting on sword hilts as they scanned the roadside for signs of ambush. The very air seemed heavy with the threat of violence, as if the land itself mourned its fallen champion. Perth's walls came into view as evening approached, the ancient stones catching the last rays of sunlight. This city had seen Scottish kings crowned and buried, had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, but never had it been asked to display the butchered remains of one of its own heroes. The gates stood open, but the guards' faces showed the strain of maintaining English rule in the heart of hostile territory. The leg was mounted on a gibbet overlooking the River Tay, positioned so that it faced south toward England in what seemed like a final gesture of defiance. Even in death and dismemberment, Wallace's remains appeared to challenge the authority that had destroyed him. The swift-flowing waters below seemed to carry whispers of rebellion, spreading word of the outrage throughout the Scottish heartland. Local priests held vigil nearby, offering prayers for Wallace's soul, while carefully avoiding any words that might be construed as sedition. Their presence lent an air of sanctity to what was intended as a warning, transforming the display into something approaching martyrdom. The final cart carried Wallace's left leg northward to Aberdeen, Scotland's granite city by the North Sea. The journey took the grisly cargo through some of Scotland's most beautiful and desolate countryside. Rolling hills covered with purple heather, ancient forests that had sheltered Celtic warriors, and rushing streams that sang with the voices of the Highlands. The driver found himself moved despite his professional detachment, understanding that he was carrying part of a legend through the very landscape that had shaped it. Aberdeen's harbour bristled with ships from across northern Europe, making it one of Scotland's most cosmopolitan cities. Merchants from Norway, Denmark, and the German states conducted business alongside Scottish traders, creating an atmosphere of international commerce that seemed at odds with the brutal display about to be erected in the city centre. The townspeople gathered in unusual numbers as word spread of the cart's arrival. Unlike the sullen hostility that had greeted the remains in other cities, Aberdeen's crowd showed a mixture of grief and barely contained fury. These were hard people, shaped by lives spent battling the North Sea's storms and the harsh granite landscape of northeastern Scotland. They understood strength and respected courage, and Wallace had embodied both qualities. The leg was mounted on a gibbet in the shadow of St. Nicholas Church, where it would be visible to both worshippers and merchants conducting business in the nearby market square. The positioning seemed almost blasphemous, displaying the butchered remains of a Scottish hero within sight of holy ground. Local clergy protested quietly, but were overruled by English officials determined to complete their grisly task. As the gibbet was raised, a low murmur arose from the crowd. Not quite a chant, not quite a song, but something that sounded like the voice of Scotland itself, mourning its lost son. The sound sent chills through the English guards, who recognised it as something far more dangerous than mere grief. It was the sound of a people who would not be broken, no matter how brutally their heroes were treated. The North Sea wind carried the sound across the harbour and out to sea, where Scottish ships heard it and understood its meaning. Back in London, Wallace's torso remained at Smithfield under heavy guard, while officials debated its final disposition. The largest portion of Scotland's champion lay covered by a blood-stained cloth, drawing curious crowds despite the English authorities' attempts to discourage gatherings. The massive chest that had once housed a heart capable of inspiring armies now served as a grim reminder of royal justice's reach. Thomas de Normanville supervised the remains with his characteristic professionalism, ensuring that the display served its intended purpose while maintaining the dignity that even the crown's enemies deserved in death. The executioner had performed his duties flawlessly, but something in his demeanour suggested that even he found this particular assignment more weighty than usual. Word arrived by fast messenger that riots had broken out in Perth and Aberdeen, with Scottish crowds attempting to storm the gibbets where Wallace's limbs were displayed. English garrisons had been forced to fire into the crowds, killing several Scottish civilians and wounding many more. The displays that were meant to discourage rebellion seemed instead to be fanning its flames. King Edward's advisors huddled in emergency session, debating whether the execution's aftermath was achieving its intended goals. Some argued that the Scottish reaction proved the displays were working striking fear into potential rebels by showing them the fate that awaited traitors. Others worried that they had created a martyr whose death might prove more dangerous than his life had ever been. The London crowds continued to gather around Wallace's torso, their behaviour growing increasingly reverent rather than celebratory. Some left flowers, others crossed themselves and whispered prayers. What was intended as a warning was slowly transforming into something resembling a shrine, much to the authorities' dismay. As evening approached, additional guards were posted around the remains. The flickering torchlight cast long shadows across Smithfield, creating an atmosphere more suited to a cathedral than an execution ground. Even in death and dismemberment, William Wallace continued to command respect from friend and foe alike, his legend growing stronger with each passing hour, rather than diminishing as the crown had hoped. Days passed, and the grisly displays across Britain began to take their toll on both the remains and the political situation. Wallace's head on London Bridge had become a pilgrimage site for Scottish merchants and visitors, who would pause to pay their respects, despite the obvious dangers of showing sympathy for a convicted traitor. Ravens had begun their work, but the face remained recognisable, its expression seeming to grow more peaceful with each passing day. In Newcastle, Wallace's right arm had attracted a following among the city's Scottish residents and sympathisers. They gathered daily at dawn and dusk, ostensibly going about their business but actually maintaining a vigil around the gibbet. English authorities found themselves in the uncomfortable position of trying to prevent what appeared to be ordinary citizens from walking through their own streets. The situation in Berwick had grown more tense, with Scottish raids increasing in frequency and ferocity along the border. Raiders struck with unprecedented coordination, as if Wallace's displayed arm was serving as a rallying point for resistance rather than a deterrent. English commanders reported that the Scots fought with unusual desperation, shouting Wallace's name as they charged English positions. Perth had become virtually ungovernable, with the English garrison forced to maintain martial law to prevent civil uprising. The gibbet displaying Wallace's leg was under constant guard, but that only seemed to emphasise its importance as a symbol of Scottish resistance. Priests conducted funeral masses for Wallace's soul, carefully avoiding treasonous language while making their message clear to all who attended. Aberdeen's situation was perhaps the most dangerous, with reports reaching London that Scottish nobles were secretly meeting in the city to plan coordinated resistance. Wallace's displayed leg had become the centre of what amounted to a cult of martyrdom, with pilgrims travelling from across Scotland to witness the remains of their fallen hero. King Edward's advisors began to realise that their carefully planned psychological warfare had backfired spectacularly. Instead of breaking Scottish resistance, Wallace's execution and the display of his remains had created a symbol more powerful than the living man had ever been. The dead champion was proving more dangerous than the living warrior had ever managed to become. A month after the execution, disturbing reports reached King Edward's court from across his realm. Wallace's death, intended to end Scottish resistance once and for all, had instead ignited a flame that threatened to consume English control of the Northern Territories. Scottish bards had begun composing songs about the execution, turning the brutal details into verses that celebrated martyrdom rather than warning against rebellion. The songs spread like wildfire through Scotland's mountains and glens, carried by travelling minstrels who transformed Wallace's agony into epic poetry. Children learned the verses by heart, their young voices singing of freedom and sacrifice in words that would echo through generations. The very brutality that was meant to terrify had instead created a legend that grew stronger with each telling. English spies reported that Wallace's name was being invoked as a battle cry from the Highlands to the borders. Scottish warriors painted his image on their shields, while mothers told their children stories of the giant who had died for Scotland's freedom. What had been intended as the final chapter of Wallace's story had instead become the first page of a new book of resistance. In the monasteries and abbeys of Scotland, monks carefully recorded the details of Wallace's execution, preserving them not as examples of English justice, but as testimony to Scottish courage. The written accounts emphasised Wallace's dignity in death, his refusal to beg for mercy, and his final words proclaiming Scotland's freedom. These chronicles would outlive the men who wrote them. The displays of Wallace's remains continued to draw crowds, but the nature of those gatherings had changed completely. What began as morbid curiosity had transformed into something approaching religious devotion. People brought their children to see the remains, teaching them that this was how a true Scot died, unbroken and unrepentant. By winter's arrival, the political landscape of Britain had shifted dramatically. Robert the Bruce, who had previously wavered in his support for Scottish independence, found himself swept up in the wave of nationalism that Wallace's death had unleashed. The gruesome details of the execution had convinced many Scottish nobles that compromise with England was impossible. Edward's justice offered only subjugation or death. Bruce met secretly with other Scottish lords in the shadow of Perth's cathedral, where Wallace's leg still hung in its gibbet, like an accusation against English rule. The irony was not lost on the assembled nobles. They were planning rebellion within sight of the dismembered remains of Scotland's greatest rebel. But rather than deterring them, the display seemed to strengthen their resolve. The winter storms that lashed Scotland's coasts seemed to echo the tempest of emotion that Wallace's death had stirred in Scottish hearts. Ships from Ireland and France brought messages of support from fellow enemies of English expansion, while Scottish exiles in European courts spoke of their martyred hero to anyone who would listen. In London, King Edward's health began to decline noticeably. Courtiers whispered that the Scottish situation was consuming him, that the failure of Wallace's execution to break Scottish resistance had shaken his confidence in the very foundations of his rule. The man who had conquered Wales and seemed poised to unite all Britain under English rule found himself facing a rebellion more dangerous than any he had previously encountered. The remains on display across Britain continued to serve as rallying points for resistance. English commanders reported that Scottish forces now fought with a ferocity that bordered on fanatical, showing no quarter and expecting none in return. Wallace's brutal death had taught them that English mercy was a myth, and they responded with the desperation of men who knew they faced extinction or victory with no middle ground. As snow began to fall across the Scottish Highlands, covering the land in a white shroud that seemed to mourn the fallen hero, it became clear that William Wallace's greatest victory had come not in life, but in death. His execution had failed in its purpose, and instead had lit a fire that would burn until Scotland was free. The first anniversary of Wallace's execution approached with Britain on the brink of civil war. Scottish forces had grown bolder throughout the year, launching coordinated attacks that demonstrated a level of organisation not seen since Wallace's own campaigns. The displayed remains had become centres of pilgrimage, with Scots travelling hundreds of miles to pay their respects to their martyred hero. Robert the Bruce had finally claimed the Scottish throne, his coronation taking place at Scone in deliberate defiance of English authority. The crown ceremony was conducted within sight of Perth, where Wallace's leg still hung in its gibbet as a reminder of the price of resistance. But rather than intimidating the new king, the display seemed to inspire him to even greater acts of defiance. English garrisons across Scotland found themselves under constant siege, not just from military forces, but from the hostile population they were meant to control. Supplies became difficult to obtain, messengers were intercepted, and English soldiers faced death or disappearance if they ventured out alone. The psychological warfare that was supposed to break Scottish resistance had instead turned the entire country into a weapon against English rule. King Edward, now showing his advanced age and declining health, prepared for another Scottish campaign with grim determination. His advisors suggested that perhaps it was time to negotiate with the Scottish rebels, but the old king refused to admit that Wallace's execution had failed in its purpose. To negotiate now would be to acknowledge that a dead rebel had defeated the living king. The anniversary of the execution brought massive crowds to all the display sites. In London, Aberdeen, Newcastle, Berwick and Perth, thousands gathered to commemorate Wallace's death not as a criminal's just punishment, but as a hero's sacrifice. English authorities found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of mourners, unable to disperse crowds that seemed to materialize from the very stones of the cities themselves. As the first anniversary passed, it became clear that Wallace's legend had grown beyond anything the living man could have achieved. His brutal death had created something unprecedented, a unified Scottish identity forged in the fire of shared outrage and crystallized around the memory of one man's unbreakable courage. 2 years after Wallace's death, the impossible began to happen. Scottish forces, united under Robert the Bruce and inspired by their martyred hero's example, began winning significant victories against English armies. The very brutality of Wallace's execution had forged a Scottish unity that transcended clan rivalries and regional differences, creating a national identity that proved stronger than English military might. The Battle of Loudoun Hill saw Bruce employ tactics that Wallace himself might have admired, using terrain and mobility to defeat a larger English force. As Scottish warriors charged into battle, they shouted Wallace's name, their voices carrying across the battlefield like a war cry from beyond the grave. English soldiers, many of whom had witnessed the execution, found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to draw strength from their martyred champion's memory. In the monasteries of Scotland, monks continued their careful work of preserving Wallace's story for future generations. Their chronicles emphasized not just his military victories, but his moral courage, his refusal to compromise with tyranny, and his willingness to die rather than betray his principles. These written accounts would survive long after the physical remains had crumbled to dust. The displays of Wallace's body parts had become shrines rather than warnings, with pilgrims leaving offerings and prayers, despite English prohibitions. Local populations protected these sites with fierce devotion, sometimes engaging in violent confrontations with English guards who tried to prevent the gatherings. What was meant to demonstrate English power instead revealed its limitations. King Edward's health continued to deteriorate as Scottish resistance mounted. Court physicians attributed his decline to the stress of the unwinnable war, but many believed that Wallace's ghost haunted the old king's dreams. The man who had ordered the brutal execution found himself facing consequences he had never anticipated. The irony was complete. Wallace's death had accomplished what his life had struggled to achieve. Scottish independence, which had seemed impossible when he was captured, now appeared inevitable. His brutal execution had transformed him from a rebel leader into a national symbol, and symbols proved far more powerful than armies in inspiring a people's resistance to tyranny. 3 years passed, and King Edward himself lay dying, his final campaign against Scotland having failed to break the resistance that Wallace's martyrdom had inspired. On his deathbed, the old king reportedly spoke of the Scottish rebel whose execution was supposed to end the war, but had instead ensured its continuation. Some claimed he expressed regret, others that he remained defiant to the end. But all agreed that Wallace's ghost seemed to haunt his final hours. The news of Edward's death spread through Scotland like wildfire, carried by swift messengers who brought word that the architect of Wallace's torment had finally met his own end. Scottish celebrations were subdued, but meaningful. They had outlasted their tormentor, and their martyred hero's sacrifice was being vindicated by events that even he could not have foreseen. Edward's son, the new king, faced a very different Scotland than the one his father had tried to conquer. The brutal execution that was meant to terrify had instead created a sense of national identity that made Scottish independence not just possible, but inevitable. The displayed remains continued to serve as focal points for resistance, transforming from symbols of English power into monuments to Scottish endurance. In the years that followed, Scottish forces won victory after victory, each success attributed partly to the inspiration drawn from Wallace's memory. The Battle of Bannockburn, where Bruce finally secured Scottish independence, was fought with Wallace's name on Scottish lips and his example in Scottish hearts. The brutal execution had failed in every one of its intended purposes. The physical remains gradually deteriorated under weather and time, but the legend they had spawned grew stronger with each passing year. Scottish children learned about Wallace not as a defeated rebel, but as a founding father, a man whose willingness to die for principle had made their freedom possible. English attempts to erase his memory through brutality had instead ensured his immortality. As the 4th anniversary of the execution approached, it was clear that history had rendered its verdict. Wallace's death had not ended Scottish resistance, but had instead guaranteed its ultimate success. The most terrifying execution in British history had become the foundation stone of Scottish independence. 5 years after the execution, pilgrims from across Europe began arriving in Scotland to see the sites where Wallace's remains were displayed. The story of the Scottish martyr had spread beyond Britain's shores, inspiring resistance movements in Ireland, Wales, and even in French territories occupied by English forces. Wallace's brutal death had become a symbol of resistance to tyranny, wherever oppressed peoples struggled for freedom. The gibbet sites had been transformed by their unexpected role as pilgrimage destinations. Local communities built shelters and hospitality houses for the constant stream of visitors, creating an economy based on martyrdom that generated more wealth for Scotland than the territories had ever produced under English rule. The execution, meant to impoverish Scottish resistance, had instead enriched it. Scottish bards now competed to compose the most stirring verses about Wallace's death, their poems spreading far beyond Scotland's borders. The execution's gruesome details, meant to horrify and deter, had instead become the raw material for epic poetry that celebrated courage in the face of impossible odds. Each retelling seemed to make the legend stronger rather than diminishing it through repetition. French and Irish envoys visited the sites regularly, paying their respects to a man whose death had demonstrated that English power had limits. Diplomatic correspondence from the period shows that European courts viewed Wallace's execution not as proof of English strength, but as evidence of English desperation, a sign that military conquest alone could not break a people's will to be free. The monastery chronicles that had carefully preserved Wallace's story began to be copied and distributed throughout Europe. Monks in Ireland, France, and Germany transcribed the accounts, ensuring that the details of both Wallace's life and death would survive even if Scotland itself fell under foreign rule again. The execution meant to end his story had instead guaranteed its preservation for posterity. Robert the Bruce, now secure on his throne, began the process of having Wallace officially recognised as a national hero rather than a convicted traitor. The legal rehabilitation was largely symbolic. Public opinion had already rendered its verdict on the execution's justice. But it marked the final transformation of Wallace from rebel to founding father. A decade had passed since Wallace's execution, and the transformation was complete. What had been intended as the ultimate demonstration of English justice had become the founding myth of Scottish independence. The execution sites were now officially recognised as national monuments, maintained by the Scottish government rather than English authorities, who had long since withdrawn from most of Scottish territory. The physical remains had long since been reduced to bone and dust, but their symbolic power had only grown stronger. Scottish artists created paintings and sculptures depicting Wallace's martyrdom, their works commissioned for churches and public buildings throughout the newly independent nation. The brutal details of his death were transformed into images of nobility and sacrifice that inspired rather than horrified. Universities across Europe began including Wallace's story in their curricula, studying his execution not as an example of effective punishment, but as a case study in how political violence could backfire spectacularly. Legal scholars debated whether the execution had been justified under the laws of the time, but popular opinion had already settled the question. Wallace was a hero, and his executioners were the criminals. Scottish merchants carried Wallace's story to trading posts around the world, spreading the legend to places that had never heard of Scotland. In far-off lands, Wallace became a symbol of resistance to imperial power, his name invoked by peoples struggling against distant overlords. The execution meant to silence him had instead given him a voice that carried to the ends of the earth. The anniversary of the execution had become Scotland's most important national holiday, celebrated with ceremonies that honoured not just Wallace, but all who had died for Scottish freedom. Children performed pageants depicting his life and death, transforming the tragic ending into a lesson about courage and principle that would shape Scottish character for generations to come. King Edward's attempt to break Scottish resistance through exemplary brutality had instead created a national identity based on the refusal to submit to tyranny. Wallace's execution had succeeded only in proving that some things were indeed worth dying for, and that death in service to principle could be more powerful than any life spent in submission to injustice. 20 years after the execution, Wallace's story had become legend, and legend had become historical fact, recorded in official documents across Europe. The man who had died as a convicted traitor was now remembered as a founding father, his execution recognized not as justice, but as judicial murder that had accidentally created a nation's independence movement. The sites where his remains had been displayed were now pilgrimage destinations comparable to religious shrines, visited by thousands annually who came to pay respects to the martyr of Scottish freedom. Local communities had built entire economies around maintaining these sites, providing food, lodging, and souvenirs for the constant stream of visitors who wanted to see where Scotland's greatest hero had been remembered. Scottish law schools taught Wallace's case as an example of how legal proceedings could be corrupted by political necessity. while English legal scholars quietly acknowledged that the execution had violated even the harsh standards of medieval justice. The trial and execution that were meant to demonstrate the rule of law had instead become textbook examples of how law could be perverted to serve political ends. The brutality of Wallace's death, which was intended to terrify potential rebels into submission, had instead become the standard by which Scottish courage was measured. Parents told their children that if they could face their problems with half the bravery Wallace had shown in his final hours, they could overcome any obstacle. The execution had transformed personal courage from abstract concept to concrete example. International diplomacy now regularly invoked Wallace's memory when discussing the rights of small nations to resist imperial domination. His name appeared in treaties and diplomatic correspondence throughout Europe, cited as proof that no empire was so powerful that it could completely crush the human spirit. The execution meant to demonstrate unlimited royal power had instead revealed its absolute limits. Scottish poets had elevated Wallace's story to epic status, comparing him to classical heroes while emphasizing that his heroism was real rather than mythical. These poems were translated into multiple languages, spreading the story far beyond Scotland's borders and ensuring that Wallace's sacrifice would be remembered long after the political circumstances that motivated it had been forgotten. A quarter century after Wallace's brutal end, his execution had achieved exactly the opposite of every goal King Edward had set for it. Instead of breaking Scottish resistance, it had created an unbreakable Scottish identity. Instead of demonstrating English power, it had revealed the limits of imperial authority. Instead of silencing rebellion, it had given every future resistance movement a voice and an example. The physical locations where Wallace's body parts had been displayed were now maintained as national shrines, their upkeep funded by the Scottish Crown and protected by laws that made desecrating them a capital offence. The irony was complete. The sites meant to warn against treason were now protected by treason laws that punished anyone who dishonoured the memory of the original traitor. European historians were beginning to write comprehensive accounts of Wallace's life and death, placing his story in the broader context of medieval resistance to imperial expansion. These scholarly works, based on careful examination of surviving documents and eyewitness accounts, consistently concluded that the execution had been both legally questionable and politically disastrous for English interests. The legend had begun to evolve beyond historical fact, with storytellers adding elements that emphasized Wallace's superhuman courage and moral purity. While historians worked to preserve accurate accounts, popular culture was creating a mythologized version that served Scottish national identity even better than the already remarkable true story. Scottish military academies taught Wallace's campaigns as examples of how inferior forces could defeat superior ones through superior motivation and tactical innovation. But they also taught his death as an example of how martyrdom could be more powerful than victory, how losing everything could paradoxically win everything, how death could triumph over life itself. The anniversary of the execution had become a continental event, with representatives from every European court sending delegations to Scotland to commemorate the death of the man who had proven that imperial power had limits. These diplomatic ceremonies served to remind all present that small nations could resist great ones, that courage could overcome force, and that some principles were indeed worth dying to defend. 30 years had transformed Wallace's execution from contemporary event to historical watershed. Scholars across Europe now divided Scottish history into two periods: before and after Wallace's martyrdom. The execution that was meant to end Scottish independence had instead marked its true beginning, creating a national consciousness that proved impossible to destroy through military force alone. The economic impact of Wallace's legend had become substantial, with pilgrim tourism generating significant revenue for Scottish communities near the former display sites. Craftsmen specialised in creating memorabilia depicting Wallace's story, while innkeepers and merchants built prosperous businesses catering to the constant stream of visitors who came to see where Scotland's greatest hero had been commemorated. Scottish universities had established academic chairs dedicated to studying Wallace's life and impact, with scholars producing detailed analyses of how his execution had changed the course of European history. These academic works were copied and distributed throughout the continent, ensuring that the lessons of Wallace's martyrdom would inform future generations of political leaders and military strategists. The legal precedents established by Wallace's case had begun appearing in courts across Europe, cited whenever defendants claimed they were being prosecuted for political rather than criminal reasons. The execution that was meant to demonstrate the supremacy of royal justice had instead become evidence that justice itself could be corrupted by political necessity. Children throughout Scotland grew up hearing Wallace's story as their foundational national myth, learning that their country existed because one man had refused to compromise his principles, even when faced with the most horrible death imaginable. This education created generations of Scots who viewed independence not as a political preference, but as a moral imperative inherited from their martyred hero. The sites where Wallace's remains had been displayed had evolved into complex memorial installations, complete with museums, libraries, and educational centres that taught visitors about both Wallace's life and the broader principles of resistance to tyranny. These institutions served not just Scottish nationalism, but the universal human desire for freedom from oppression. International law was beginning to incorporate concepts derived from Wallace's case, particularly the idea that certain forms of resistance to tyranny were morally justified even when technically illegal under the laws of occupying powers. 4 decades after the execution, Wallace's story had transcended national boundaries to become a universal symbol of resistance to oppression. His name was invoked by freedom fighters from Ireland to Italy, from Wales to the Germanic states. Wherever people struggled against imperial domination, the execution meant to silence one voice had instead given voice to countless liberation movements. The transformation of the execution sites into major pilgrimage destinations had fundamentally altered the communities around them. Entire towns existed primarily to serve visitors who came to pay respects to Wallace's memory, creating economies based entirely on martyrdom tourism. The English authorities who had chosen these locations for maximum humiliation could never have imagined they were creating Scotland's most prosperous commercial centres. Scottish artists had elevated Wallace's story to the level of classical mythology, creating paintings, sculptures, and architectural monuments that depicted his martyrdom with the same reverence once reserved for religious subjects. These artistic works were commissioned for public display throughout Scotland and copied for distribution across Europe, ensuring that Wallace's image became as familiar as that of any saint or classical hero. The anniversary of the execution had evolved into a week-long festival that attracted visitors from across the known world. Diplomatic delegations, scholarly conferences, artistic competitions, and religious ceremonies all centered around commemorating the death that had accidentally created a nation. The event that was meant to demonstrate English dominance had become an annual celebration of Scottish independence. Legal scholars continued to study Wallace's case as a foundational example of how judicial proceedings could be corrupted by political necessity. Law schools across Europe used his trial and execution as a teaching tool, demonstrating how legal forms could be maintained while legal substance was perverted. The case that was meant to demonstrate the rule of law had become a textbook example of its abuse. The sites themselves had become so sacred to Scottish national identity that they were guarded more carefully than royal palaces. Special military units were assigned to protect them from any possible desecration, while elaborate ceremonies marked every significant anniversary. The locations chosen to humiliate Scotland had become the most honoured places in the Scottish national landscape. Half a century had passed, and Wallace's execution was now taught in universities across Europe as the quintessential example of how political violence could achieve exactly the opposite of its intended goals. The case had become required reading for students of statecraft, military strategy, and political philosophy, demonstrating how martyrdom could be more powerful than any military victory. The physical sites where Wallace's remains had been displayed were now among the most visited locations in all of Britain, drawing more pilgrims annually than many religious shrines. The economic impact extended far beyond the immediate communities, with entire trade routes developing to serve the constant flow of visitors who came to pay their respects to Scotland's martyred hero. Scottish culture had been fundamentally shaped by the Wallace legend, with his story serving as the template for understanding courage, sacrifice, and national duty. Every significant decision in Scottish politics was evaluated against the standard Wallace had set. Would this choice honour his memory, or would it betray the principles for which he died? The execution had created not just a martyr, but a moral compass for an entire nation. The brutality of Wallace's death, which had been intended to horrify potential rebels into submission, had instead become the measure by which all Scottish courage was judged. Parents taught their children that facing ordinary difficulties with Wallace-like determination was the essence of Scottish character. The execution had accidentally defined an entire people's understanding of themselves. International diplomacy regularly invoked Wallace's example when discussing the rights of conquered peoples to resist their conquerors. His name appeared in treaties and formal agreements throughout Europe, cited as precedent for the principle that some forms of resistance were morally justified, regardless of their technical legality. The execution, meant to establish unlimited royal authority, had instead helped establish limits on that authority. The anniversary commemorations had grown so elaborate that they rivaled coronations in their splendour and international significance. Kings and emperors sent representatives to honour the memory of a man who had died as a convicted criminal, acknowledging that history had rendered a different verdict than the court that condemned him. 60 years after Wallace's death, the generation that had witnessed his execution was passing away, but their children and grandchildren had elevated his story to legendary status that transcended historical fact. The brutal reality of his final hours had been transformed into epic poetry that emphasized his spiritual triumph over physical defeat, his moral victory over judicial murder. The sites of his martyrdom had become so central to Scottish identity that they were incorporated into the kingdom's official heraldry and ceremonial protocols. No Scottish king could be properly crowned without making pilgrimage to the places where Wallace's remains had been displayed. Acknowledging the debt that Scottish independence owed to his sacrifice, the execution had accidentally created sacred sites more important to Scottish legitimacy than ancient castles or traditional coronation stones. European chroniclers were writing comprehensive histories that placed Wallace's execution in the broader context of medieval resistance to imperial expansion. These scholarly works, based on careful analysis of surviving documents and eyewitness testimonies, consistently concluded that the execution had been both legally questionable and politically catastrophic for English imperial ambitions. The legend had begun to influence art and literature far beyond Scotland's borders, with poets, painters, and sculptors across Europe creating works inspired by Wallace's martyrdom. These artistic interpretations emphasized universal themes of courage, sacrifice, and resistance to tyranny that resonated with audiences who had never heard of Scotland, but understood the struggle against oppression. Scottish military tradition had been fundamentally shaped by Wallace's example, with every regiment and unit tracing its inspiration back to the warriors who had fought for their martyred hero. Military ceremonies included ritual remembrance of Wallace's sacrifice, while tactical manuals studied his campaigns as examples of how inferior forces could defeat superior ones through superior motivation and moral clarity. The economic impact of Wallace's legend had grown so substantial that it supported entire regions of Scotland, with communities specialising in various aspects of martyrdom commemoration. Craftsmen, scholars, innkeepers, guides, and countless others made their living from the constant stream of pilgrims who came to honour the memory of the man whose brutal death had accidentally created their nation's independence. 70 years had transformed Wallace's execution from historical event to foundational myth that shaped not just Scottish but European understanding of legitimate resistance to tyranny. Legal scholars across the continent cited his case when arguing that moral law sometimes transcended written law, that certain forms of resistance were not just permissible but obligatory when confronting absolute tyranny. The sites where his body parts had been displayed were now pilgrimage destinations that rivaled Jerusalem and Rome in their significance to medieval spirituality. The Catholic Church had begun quietly investigating the possibility of Wallace's canonization, recognizing that his martyrdom had taken on religious as well as political significance. The execution meant to condemn him as a traitor had instead created a candidate for sainthood. Scottish culture had evolved to make Wallace's story the central narrative of national identity, with every major cultural expression, from architecture to music to literature, incorporating elements derived from his legend. Children learned mathematics, using examples drawn from his military campaigns, while moral education centered on his example of principled resistance to corruption. The execution had accidentally created a comprehensive educational philosophy based on martyrdom. The anniversary commemorations had grown so elaborate that they influenced the development of public ceremony throughout Europe, establishing precedents for how nations should honour their founding martyrs. Kings and emperors studied Scottish ceremonial protocols when designing their own national celebrations, recognising that Wallace's legacy had created new standards for honouring national heroes. International merchants had begun incorporating Wallace's image into their trade goods, recognising that his story had universal appeal that transcended national boundaries. Textiles, pottery, metalwork, and other crafts featuring his likeness were traded from Scotland to Constantinople, spreading his legend through commercial networks that reached every corner of the known world. The transformation was complete. The man executed as a traitor had become a saint. The criminal had become a hero. The warning had become an inspiration. King Edward's carefully planned demonstration of absolute power had instead demonstrated the limits of that power, showing the world that some spirits could not be broken by any amount of physical brutality. 80 years after the execution, Wallace's story had become so embedded in European consciousness that it influenced how rulers across the continent thought about the relationship between power and legitimacy. The case was studied not just as history, but as political science, demonstrating how excessive brutality could undermine rather than strengthen governmental authority. The pilgrimage sites had evolved into complex academic and spiritual centres, with libraries, schools, and research institutions dedicated to studying both Wallace's life and the broader principles of resistance to tyranny. These centres attracted scholars from across Europe, creating international communities of learning centred around the memory of Scotland's martyred hero. Scottish law had developed unique characteristics derived from Wallace's example, emphasising the principle that legal authority derived ultimately from moral authority rather than mere force. Scottish courts cited his case when ruling that certain laws were invalid if they violated fundamental principles of justice, creating legal precedents that influenced jurisprudence throughout Europe. The artistic legacy had grown so substantial that Wallace's story was now depicted in every major European art form: painting, sculpture, architecture, music, literature, and the emerging art of theatrical performance. These works were translated, copied, and adapted for local audiences, ensuring that his legend reached every level of European society, from peasant villages to royal courts. Military strategists across Europe studied Wallace's campaigns as examples of how moral superiority could overcome material disadvantage, how popular support could compensate for inferior resources, and how martyrdom could achieve strategic objectives that military victory could not accomplish. His death was taught as a form of warfare in itself, the ultimate strategic sacrifice that won the war by losing the battle. The economic transformation of Scotland had been so complete that the nation's prosperity was largely built on the foundation of Wallace's martyrdom. Entire industries existed to serve the constant flow of pilgrims, scholars, and political leaders who came to study the sites where Scotland's independence had been born through one man's refusal to submit to tyranny. The anniversary had become a continental holiday, celebrated not just in Scotland but throughout Europe, as a day dedicated to remembering all who had died resisting oppression. Nearly a century after Wallace's brutal end, his execution was recognized as one of the pivotal moments that had reshaped European political thought. The case was taught in every major university as the definitive example of how political violence could achieve exactly the opposite of its intended goals, demonstrating that martyrdom could be more strategically effective than any military campaign. The sites where his remains had been displayed were now among the most significant pilgrimage destinations in all of Christendom, drawing visitors from as far away as the Byzantine Empire and the emerging Islamic world. These international pilgrims came not just to honor Wallace, but to study the principles of resistance to tyranny that his death had exemplified. Scottish political institutions had become the gold standard for enlightened governance throughout Europe, with constitutional principles derived from Wallace's martyrdom serving as the foundation for the most advanced system of limited government the world had ever seen. Foreign kings and emperors regularly consulted Scottish advisors about how to organize their own realms around principles of justice rather than mere force. The international influence had reached every corner of the known world, with Wallace's story inspiring resistance movements from the Atlantic to the Black Sea, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. His name had become synonymous with the principle that no earthly power could legitimately demand the surrender of fundamental human dignity, regardless of the consequences of resistance. The transformation of European law around principles derived from Wallace's case had created the world's first international system of human rights, with legal scholars from every major kingdom contributing to an expanding body of jurisprudence that limited governmental authority and protected individual conscience. The execution that was meant to demonstrate unlimited royal power had instead created the legal foundations for constitutional democracy. The economic miracle that had grown from Wallace's legacy had made Scotland the wealthiest and most prosperous nation in Europe, demonstrating conclusively that societies organized around justice and freedom could achieve greater material success than those based on conquest and oppression. Merchants and craftsmen from across the continent came to study Scottish methods, seeking to understand how martyrdom had been transformed into prosperity. The anniversary had evolved into the most significant political event in the European calendar, with diplomatic representatives from every major power gathering annually to reaffirm their commitment to the principles of legitimate government that Wallace's death had helped establish. The execution that was meant to terrify potential rebels had instead created an annual celebration of the right to resist tyranny that influenced political thought throughout the civilized world. A full century had passed since Wallace's execution, and the transformation was complete beyond anything King Edward could have imagined. The brutal death, meant to end Scottish resistance, had instead created the foundational legend of Scottish independence, influencing not just Scotland, but the entire development of European ideas about freedom, resistance, and legitimate government. The centennial anniversary brought delegations from every major kingdom and empire in the known world, all coming to honor the memory of a man who had died as a convicted traitor, but was now recognized as one of history's greatest champions of human freedom. The execution sites had become sacred ground, comparable to the holiest places in Christendom. Scottish universities had established the world's first academic programs dedicated to studying the principles of legitimate resistance to tyranny, with Wallace's case serving as the foundational text for what would become political science. Scholars from across Europe competed for admission to these programs, recognizing that Scotland had become the world's leading centre for understanding the relationship between power and moral authority. The artistic legacy had grown so vast that Wallace's story was now told in every language spoken in Europe, adapted to local cultures while maintaining its essential message about the triumph of spirit over force. These cultural adaptations ensured that his legend would survive even if Scotland itself were to disappear, embedding his example permanently in European consciousness. The economic impact had transformed Scotland from one of Europe's poorest nations into one of its most prosperous, with wealth generated by pilgrimage tourism, scholarly exchange, and the export of Wallace-inspired art and literature. The martyrdom that was meant to impoverish Scottish resistance had instead enriched the entire nation. Most remarkably, the legal principles derived from Wallace's case had begun to influence law throughout Europe, with courts citing his example when ruling that governmental authority had moral as well as legal limits. The execution that was meant to demonstrate unlimited royal power had instead helped establish the foundations of constitutional government. The man who had died in agony at Smithfield had achieved immortality, not despite his brutal death, but because of it, his suffering transformed into the cornerstone of Scottish independence and European freedom. 110 years after the execution, Wallace's legend had achieved something unprecedented in medieval history. It had fundamentally altered how European civilization understood the relationship between ruler and ruled. The case was no longer taught merely as Scottish history, but as the foundational example of how moral authority ultimately trumped political power. The sites of his martyrdom had evolved into international universities dedicated to studying the principles of justice and resistance, attracting students from every corner of the known world. These institutions had become more influential than traditional seats of learning, recognized as the places where the future of political thought was being shaped by the memory of one man's principled refusal to submit to tyranny. Scottish culture had been so thoroughly shaped by Wallace's example that the entire nation functioned as a living monument to his principles. Every aspect of Scottish law, education, art, and social organisation reflected the values for which he had died, creating a society that served as a practical demonstration of the political philosophy his martyrdom had inspired. The international influence had grown so substantial that Wallace's name was invoked in political documents from England to the Byzantine Empire, from Ireland to the emerging kingdoms of Eastern Europe. His story had become the template for understanding legitimate resistance to oppression, influencing how subject peoples across the continent thought about their relationship to imperial power. The transformation of the execution from warning to inspiration was now complete beyond any possibility of reversal. What had been intended as the ultimate demonstration of English power had instead become the ultimate demonstration of its limits, showing that some spirits could not be broken by any amount of physical brutality or legal condemnation. The anniversary had evolved into an international festival of freedom that influenced similar celebrations throughout Europe, establishing precedents for how nations should commemorate their independence and honour their founding martyrs. Kings and emperors who had once feared Wallace's example now competed to associate themselves with his legacy, recognising that history had rendered its verdict on the justice of his cause. 120 years had transformed Wallace's execution into the most studied political event in European history, analysed by scholars not just as a moment of Scottish resistance, but as the turning point when medieval concepts of unlimited royal authority began giving way to emerging ideas about constitutional government and individual rights. The pilgrimage sites had become permanent international institutions, with resident communities of scholars, artists, and political thinkers who dedicated their lives to understanding and expanding upon the principles Wallace's martyrdom had established. These communities had grown so influential that they advised kings and emperors throughout Europe on questions of governance and legitimate authority. The legal precedents established by Wallace's case had evolved into a comprehensive theory of resistance that influenced jurisprudence across the continent. European courts regularly cited Scottish interpretations of Wallace's legacy when ruling on questions of governmental overreach, creating a body of law that limited royal authority in ways that would have been unthinkable before his death. Scottish society had become a model for other European nations, demonstrating how a country could prosper when organised around principles of justice rather than mere force. Diplomatic missions from across the continent came to study Scottish institutions, seeking to understand how Wallace's martyrdom had created a form of government that generated both prosperity and popular loyalty. The artistic legacy had grown so vast that Wallace's story was now preserved in every conceivable medium, from illuminated manuscripts to architectural monuments, from musical compositions to theatrical performances. These works had been translated into dozens of languages and exported throughout the known world, ensuring that his example would influence human thought long after the political circumstances that created it had been forgotten. The anniversary celebrations had evolved into the most significant annual event in European political life, with representatives from every major kingdom gathering in Scotland to reaffirm their commitment to the principles of legitimate government that Wallace's death had helped establish. The execution, that was meant to terrify potential rebels, had instead created an annual celebration of the right to resist tyranny. 130 years after Wallace's death, his execution was recognised as the event that had fundamentally changed the trajectory of European civilization, marking the beginning of the end for medieval concepts of absolute monarchy and unlimited royal authority. The case was now required study for anyone seeking to understand how modern ideas about government and individual rights had emerged from medieval political thought. The sites where his remains had been displayed were now permanent international centres for the study of political philosophy, law, and human rights, with libraries containing the world's most comprehensive collections of materials related to resistance theory and legitimate government. These institutions had become more influential than traditional universities, recognized as the places where the future of human freedom was being theoretically and practically developed. Scottish political institutions had evolved into the most advanced system of limited government in Europe, with constitutional principles derived directly from Wallace's example, serving as checks on royal power that other nations studied and attempted to replicate. The martyrdom that was meant to demonstrate the futility of resistance had instead created the most successful example of popular sovereignty in the medieval world. The international influence had grown so substantial that Wallace's political philosophy was now taught from Ireland to the Byzantine Empire, influencing how subject peoples throughout Europe understood their rights and obligations in relation to governmental authority. His death had accidentally created the intellectual foundation for what would eventually become democratic government. The transformation of European law around principles derived from Wallace's case had created unprecedented protections for individual conscience and resistance to unjust authority. Legal scholars across the continent cited Scottish precedents when arguing that certain governmental actions were inherently illegitimate, regardless of their technical legality, establishing foundations for constitutional law that would influence Western civilization for centuries. The economic prosperity that had grown from Wallace's legacy had made Scotland one of Europe's wealthiest nations, demonstrating that societies organised around principles of justice, rather than mere force, could achieve greater prosperity than those based on military conquest and oppression. The execution that was meant to impoverish Scottish resistance had instead created unprecedented national wealth. 140 years had passed, and Wallace's execution was now viewed as one of history's greatest examples of unintended consequences, demonstrating how political violence designed to crush resistance could instead create movements that outlasted the empires that employed such violence. The case was studied not just as Scottish history, but as universal human experience relevant to any struggle between power and principle. The memorial sites had evolved into the world's leading centres for understanding the relationship between martyrdom and political change, with research programmes that influenced how governments throughout Europe thought about the use of force against their own populations. The sites that were meant to terrify had instead become places where rulers learned about the limits of their own authority. Scottish legal principles derived from Wallace's example had been adopted throughout Europe, creating the first international system of law that recognised limits on governmental power and rights of individual conscience. The execution that was meant to demonstrate unlimited royal authority had instead created the legal foundations for limited government that would eventually spread throughout the Western world. The cultural impact had grown so profound that Wallace's story was now an integral part of European identity, told in every major language and adapted to every local culture, while maintaining its essential message about the triumph of spirit over force. The legend had transcended its Scottish origins to become universal human heritage. The philosophical legacy had influenced the development of political thought throughout Europe, with scholars from every major university contributing to an expanding body of theory about legitimate resistance to tyranny. Wallace's martyrdom had accidentally created the intellectual framework for understanding when governmental authority became illegitimate, and resistance became not just permissible, but obligatory. The anniversary celebrations had evolved into continental festivals of freedom that influenced similar commemorations throughout Europe, establishing protocols for how free peoples should remember their liberation and honour those who had died for their freedom. The execution that was meant to end Scottish independence had instead created the template for celebrating human freedom throughout the civilised world. Most remarkably, the economic prosperity generated by Wallace's legacy had demonstrated that societies based on justice and freedom could achieve greater wealth and happiness than those based on conquest and oppression. 150 years after Wallace's execution, the transformation was so complete that King Edward's attempt to crush Scottish resistance was now taught as history's most spectacular political miscalculation. The execution that was meant to end Wallace's influence had instead made him immortal. His story embedded so deeply in European consciousness that it had fundamentally altered how civilization thought about freedom, resistance, and legitimate government. The sites of his martyrdom had become pilgrimage destinations that rivaled Rome and Jerusalem in their significance to European spirituality and political thought. These places had evolved into permanent international communities dedicated to studying and advancing the principles of human freedom that Wallace's death had exemplified, attracting visitors and residents from every corner of the known world. Scottish political institutions had become the model for emerging concepts of constitutional government throughout Europe, with foreign delegations regularly coming to study how a nation could prosper when organised around principles of justice rather than mere force. The martyrdom that was meant to serve as a warning had instead created a blueprint for successful governance that other nations sought to replicate. The international influence had grown so vast that Wallace's name was now invoked in political documents and resistance movements from Ireland to the Holy Land, from Wales to the emerging kingdoms of Eastern Europe. His story had become the universal template for understanding legitimate resistance to oppression, transcending national and cultural boundaries to become part of human heritage. The legal revolution that had grown from Wallace's case had created the foundations of what would eventually become constitutional law, establishing principles about the limits of governmental authority and the rights of individual conscience that influenced jurisprudence throughout the Western world. The execution that was meant to demonstrate unlimited royal power had instead helped establish the intellectual and legal foundations for limited government. The anniversary had evolved into the most significant celebration of human freedom in the medieval world, with representatives from every major kingdom gathering annually to reaffirm their commitment to the principles that Wallace's martyrdom had established. The death that was meant to end Scottish resistance had instead created an eternal symbol of the human spirit's refusal to submit to tyranny. 160 years had transformed Wallace's brutal execution into one of history's most profound examples of how suffering could be transformed into strength, how death could triumph over life, and how martyrdom could achieve what military victory never could. The execution was now studied not just as political history, but as spiritual testimony to the indomitable nature of the human spirit when confronted with ultimate tyranny. The memorial sites had evolved into international universities of freedom, with permanent faculties dedicated to advancing human understanding of justice, resistance, and legitimate government. These institutions had become more influential than traditional centers of learning, recognized as the places where the future of human liberty was being both theoretically understood and practically implemented. Scottish society had become living proof that Wallace's principles could create unprecedented prosperity and happiness when applied to actual governance. Other European nations sent observers to study how a country organized around justice rather than force could achieve such remarkable success, both materially and spiritually. The philosophical legacy had influenced every major thinker in Europe, with scholars from every tradition contributing to an ever-expanding understanding of the principles Wallace's martyrdom had exemplified. His death had accidentally created the intellectual foundation for concepts of human dignity and individual rights that would eventually transform Western civilization. The cultural impact had grown so profound that Wallace's story was now told in every art form known to human creativity, translated into every language spoken in Europe, and adapted to every local tradition while maintaining its essential message about the triumph of principle over power. The legend had become universal human heritage that transcended all national and cultural boundaries. The legal revolution that had grown from his case had created international recognition of fundamental human rights that limited governmental authority throughout Europe. Courts from Ireland to the Byzantine Empire cited Scottish legal precedents derived from Wallace's example when ruling that certain governmental actions were inherently illegitimate regardless of their technical legality. The anniversary celebrations had become so elaborate and internationally significant that they influenced the development of civic ceremony throughout the civilized world, establishing precedents for how free peoples should commemorate their liberty and honor those who had died to secure it. 170 years after Wallace's death, his execution had achieved a kind of historical perfection, a single event that had completely reversed its intended meaning and transformed human understanding of the relationship between power and moral authority. The case was now considered essential knowledge for anyone seeking to understand how the modern world had emerged from medieval tyranny. The sites where his body had been displayed were now among the most sacred places in European civilization, comparable to the holiest religious shrines in their significance to human spiritual and political development. These locations had become permanent symbols of humanity's capacity to transform suffering into wisdom, death into eternal life, and apparent defeat into ultimate victory. Scottish political, struggling against chains, scanning the hostile crowd with defiant eyes, briefly closing eyes as if remembering Scotland, maintaining steady breathing despite fear. 180 years had passed, and Wallace's execution was now recognized as the moment when the ancient world ended and the modern world began. The point at which medieval concepts of unlimited royal authority gave way to emerging ideas about constitutional government, individual rights, and the consent of the governed. The brutal death that was meant to preserve the old order had instead ushered in a new age of human freedom. The memorial sites had transcended their origins as places of execution to become temples of liberty, where pilgrims from every nation came not just to honor Wallace's memory, but to rededicate themselves to the principles of justice and freedom that his martyrdom had established. These locations had become more significant to European civilization than ancient Rome or Athens, recognized as the birthplaces of modern political thought. Scottish civilization had evolved into the most advanced society on earth, with institutions of government, law, education, and social organization that served as models for emerging nations throughout Europe and beyond. The martyrdom that was meant to crush Scottish resistance had instead created the blueprint for human freedom that would eventually spread throughout the world. The philosophical revolution that had grown from Wallace's case had influenced every major thinker of the age, creating new understanding of human dignity, individual rights, and legitimate government that would reshape civilization itself. His death had accidentally provided the intellectual foundation for what would become the Enlightenment, democracy, and human rights as universal principles. The cultural legacy had grown so vast that Wallace's story was now embedded in the consciousness of every European people, told in countless languages and art forms while maintaining its essential message about the triumph of spirit over force. The legend had achieved true immortality, transcending its historical origins to become eternal human truth. The legal transformation had created international recognition of fundamental human rights that limited governmental power throughout the civilized world, establishing precedents that would influence law and justice for centuries to come. The execution that was meant to demonstrate absolute authority had instead created the foundations of constitutional government that would eventually spread across the globe. 190 years after Wallace's execution, the transformation was so complete that historians struggled to find adequate language to describe how thoroughly the event had achieved the opposite of every one of its intended goals. The death that was meant to end Scottish resistance had instead created the intellectual, legal, and moral foundations for the concept of human freedom that would eventually transform the entire world. The sites of his martyrdom were now pilgrimage destinations that attracted visitors from continents beyond Europe. As word of Wallace's story had spread through trade routes and diplomatic exchanges to reach civilizations that had never heard of Scotland, but understood the universal human struggle against tyranny. These places had become symbols of hope for oppressed peoples everywhere, demonstrating that no empire was so powerful that it could completely crush the human spirit. Scottish society had achieved a level of prosperity, justice, and freedom that surpassed anything previously known in human history, creating a living demonstration that Wallace's principles could indeed transform the world when properly applied. Other nations sent delegations not just to study Scottish methods, but to seek guidance on how they too might organize their societies around justice rather than force. The philosophical legacy had grown so influential that no serious discussion of government, law, or human rights could proceed without reference to the principles that Wallace's martyrdom had established. His death had provided the foundation for understanding that legitimate authority came from moral rather than military sources, that individual conscience had rights that no earthly power could legitimately violate. The international legal system that had grown from his case had created unprecedented protections for human dignity and individual rights that influenced law throughout the known world. Courts from Ireland to the Byzantine Empire, from Norway to the emerging kingdoms of Eastern Europe, regularly cited precedents derived from Wallace's example when limiting governmental authority and protecting individual freedom. The anniversary celebrations had evolved into the most significant annual affirmation of human freedom in the civilized world, with representatives from every major power gathering to recommit themselves to the principles of legitimate government that his brutal death had accidentally established. 200 years had passed since William Wallace's execution, and the complete reversal of its intended meaning had achieved a kind of historical perfection that defied comprehension. The death that was meant to demonstrate the futility of resistance to tyranny had instead become the eternal symbol of humanity's refusal to submit to injustice, inspiring freedom movements that would eventually liberate half the world. The memorial sites had transcended their origins to become the holiest places in human civilization, more significant than any religious shrine or ancient monument in their importance to the development of human freedom. Pilgrims came from every corner of the earth, from lands unknown to medieval Europeans, drawn by the universal truth that one person's willingness to die for principle could indeed change the world. Scottish civilization had become the template for human freedom itself, with institutions so advanced and just that they served as models for emerging nations on continents that didn't exist in Wallace's time. The martyrdom that was meant to crush one small nation's resistance had instead created the blueprint for liberation that would eventually spread to every inhabited land on Earth. The philosophical revolution that began with Wallace's death had transformed human understanding of government, law, and individual rights so completely that the medieval world from which he came seemed like ancient prehistory. His execution had marked not just the end of one man's life, but the beginning of the modern world's recognition that human dignity was the foundation of all legitimate authority. The legal legacy had created international recognition of fundamental human rights that influenced law on every continent, establishing principles that would outlast every empire that had existed in Wallace's time. The execution that was meant to demonstrate unlimited royal power had instead created the foundations of constitutional government that would eventually govern half the human race. As the bicentennial approached, it was clear that Wallace's greatest victory had been achieved not through military conquest, but through moral example, not through political success, but through spiritual triumph. The man who died in agony at Smithfield had become immortal, his legend destined to inspire human freedom until the end of time itself.